Judges Corner is brought to you by CoolStuffInc.com and gatheringmagic.com. Support our show by visiting both websites. Now it's time for Judges Corner with David Green.
Hey everyone, thanks for watching Judges Corner. Today we're going to talk about the different ways in which we cast spells. For example, playing a Tarmogoyf, or a Ponder, or a Lightning Bolt. Exactly how do we go about doing that? Well, there's a couple of steps that we go through, and in today's episode we're going to go over all 7 steps and give a couple of examples to better illustrate how the steps work. So let's dive right in and take a look at our first step. Let's say you play a Barbed Lightning. You tap 3 mountains and say, I'll deal you 3 damage with Barbed Lightning. Is that okay? Now it's on the stack and everyone has a chance to respond to it or let it resolve. But a lot actually happened here. The first step in casting a spell that we're going to cover is to announce it and just put it straight onto the stack. It's not officially cast yet for things like Dragon's Claw, but that'll come later. The next step is to choose modes for a spell, much like when we elected to deal 3 damage to a player with Barbed Lightning. Modal spells are formatted like Barbed Lightning or even Cryptic Command, where you get to choose a part of the spell that you want to use and the rest is ignored. But there's more to this step than just modes. We also reveal cards for splice cards, or announce our intent to pay alternative costs, like Flashback, or discarding a card and paying a life for Force of Will, or additional costs, like Kicker. We choose the value of X in spells like Bonfire of the Damned, or Sphinx's Revelation. We determine the colors for hybrid mana that we're going to be spending. Or maybe we determine that we're going to be paying 2 life or just paying whatever the mana color is for Phyrexia mana. Basically, anything where we need to make a choice regarding the spell alone is made in the second step. Third, we select targets for each instance of the word target on a spell. If a spell has only one instance of the word target, but tells you to select multiple targets, such as the case with Hex or Into the Core, you need to pick a different target, otherwise you can't cast the card. If a spell simply says the word target again and again, like in the case of Seeds of Strength, you may select the same thing for more than one instance of the word target. And if something says select a target and then select another target, like in the case of Arc Trail, the targets have to be different. The fourth step tends to get lumped together with the third, and for good reason. It's here that we select how those targets will be affected. What I mean by this is, if you need to pick multiple targets for a spell, and some of those targets will be affected differently, it's in this step that we decide how they'll be affected. Like, take for example with Arc Trail, where one of the previously chosen targets will be taking 1 damage, and another will be taking 2. Also, when dividing damage, perhaps with Aurelia's Fury, you have to divide the damage between each target. For example, if you control 2 Phantasmal Bears and a Canyon Minotaur, and I cast Aurelia's Fury for X equals 3, targeting each of the images and the Minotaur, then I have to deal at least 1 damage to each creature. I can't select 0 for the bears so that they'll be sacrificed to their own ability and then 3 to the Minotaur. The fifth step is where we total the cost of the spell. We take the original costs, or any alternative costs that were paid, and then we apply additions to those costs, like with Thalia or Suppression Field. Then we apply reductions through things like Ethereum Sculptor or Affinity. Finally, we apply cost-setting effects, like with Trinisphere. Now, this order is important. For example, let's say I'm trying to cast a Mox Opal with Ethereum Sculptor in play, while my opponent controls the Thalia. If we didn't apply cost totaling in the order of addition, subtraction, and then setting, we would have a Mox Opal with -1 to its cost first, making it continue to cost 0 since mana cost can never drop below 0. Then it would increase by 1, making it cost a total of 1 mana. That doesn't seem right, does it? After all of that, the costs are locked in. So, for example, if we were to cast a Mirror Enforcer for only 2 mana, since we control 5 other artifacts, and then we pass priority to our opponents after we've finally cast the card but we're waiting to see if it resolves, if our opponent were to naturalize one of our artifacts, the cost wouldn't suddenly jump up and we'd have to pay even more. This is because the cost is locked in. Now, before we get to the end of casting a spell, we have a 6th step that we want to cover. This is where we tap lands to pay for spells, or activate other mana abilities available to us. You could also tap your lands in advance, I suppose, to float the mana. And a reason a player might do this is if they've locked themselves into a corner with their opponent with, say, mana barbs. You could tap the lands for a lethal lightning bolt that you plan on casting against your opponent, putting the trigger on the stack for mana barbs, and then responding to it by actually casting the lightning bolt to kill your opponent before you die. However, if you were to cast the lightning bolt the normal way that we pay for spells, you might die to the mana barbs trigger before that spell ever resolves. Finally, we pay all costs in any order. At this point, you might be thinking, it all ends with, check please. But sometimes there might be a reason to pay a certain way. For example, what if we played a Momentous Fall on our Omnath while we had 4 green mana in our pool? Well, because we can pay costs in any order, we could elect to sacrifice Omnath first while he's a 5/5, and then pay the mana in our pool. Or we could pay the mana first and drop Omnath to a 1/1, and then sacrifice it. The choice is yours. After all of that, the spell is finally cast. Things that trigger off of spells being cast, like Dragon's Claw or Hive Mind, will finally trigger. So let's go back to that Barbed Lightning we were talking about earlier. Now let's run through how to cast that with all of the steps and see exactly how things really work. First, we announce it and put it onto the stack. Next, we choose anything internally, like dealing damage to a player instead of a creature, or even both if we choose to entwine it. After that, we select a target for each instance of the word target on the spell, or on the spell for the selected modes that we chose. In this case, it's our opponent. No other optional choices are necessary, so we can jump straight onto cost totaling. Since things like Thalia, Ruby Medallion, or even Trinisphere aren't in play, the cost is locked in as just 1 red and 2 colorless. Now I can add mana to my mana pool, maybe by sacrificing a Satyr Hedonist for the mana. And finally, we pay the mana into the spell. It's cast, and now priority can be passed around, so it can be responded to and eventually resolved. So now that you know the 7 steps involved in casting a spell, you might be thinking, how the heck am I going to remember that? Fortunately, there's a really popular mnemonic that's been around for a long time now, and that is, all crazy teens have tried magic pills, which stands for announce and put it on the stack, choose the modes, then choose the targets, and then how those targets will be affected. Next, you total the cost, and then activate any mana abilities. And finally, pay the costs in any order. The last thing I want to cover is that all the steps involved in casting a spell are virtually identical to the same steps involved in activating an ability, or putting a triggered ability onto the stack. There's a few slight differences in how we start things off, but the steps are virtually the same, and just modified for the specific things that are being placed onto the stack. So, with that concludes our episode. If you have any questions, make sure to send us an email at judgescorner@gatheringmagic.com. And until next time, make sure to shuffle thoroughly, play at a reasonable pace, and have fun.